All right. OK, so thank you for having me here. So I'm not someone with particularly deep experience in the kind of CI/CD tools that have been discussed by everybody else. I'm a computational social scientist, and I'm a teacher at the University of Washington. But as part of my work there, and as part of things that I've done for a while, I study and I build and I advocate for the provision of sort of public information goods, goods like, and in particular, sort of free and open source software and like free culture. And in that sense, I think that I do have a message that's relevant to this audience. What I hope to do today is to make an argument grounded in a little bit of this community is maybe like ancient history at this time, that free software needs to use free tools. I'm going to explain why I think that, and I'm going to try to explain how we can get there. So I've been participating in free and open source software for now more than 2 decades. This makes me feel old when I say that. And I want to begin with a story that might be familiar to some of you that have been around for a long time. But it's the story of Bitkeeper and the Linux kernel. So Bitkeeper is a revision control system. It was actually one of the first sort of distributed revision control systems, and it pioneered or was sort of made accessible a whole bunch of features that anybody who sort of develops software on the internet today, which is presumably most of you, will now take for granted. Things that allow people to work offline easily or maintain branches with low effort, merge changes in ways that took history into account. So on and so forth. Bitkeeper was first released 18 years ago in this month, in May 2000, under a proprietary software license. It was developed by a guy named Larry McVoy and his company Bitmover. Now, the Bitmover business model was pretty typical. Basically, they sold licenses to use Bitkeeper. McVoy was also a Linux kernel developer, and he wanted to help Linux, the Linux kernel project, and other similar free and open source software projects. So he made a special community version of Bitkeeper that allowed hackers to use it without having to buy a license, but only for free software, only for open source software projects. Now, this free version came with a couple other asterisks, other than you can only use it for that. The community version communicated to servers that were run by Bitmover so that the company could monitor what you were using it for. And so that, as a result, they could also sort of approve or disapprove what it was being used for. And the terms of service, that document that we all carefully read every time we use a piece of software, for both the community and the paid versions, barred users from participating in the development of any competing version control system. All right. So in circa 2002, the Linux kernel was still using CVS, the concurrent versioning system, which is if you're fortunate enough to not be familiar with it, is an older version control system that was actually first released in 1990. And for a whole bunch of reasons that may be obvious to you if you are unfortunate enough to be familiar with CVS, it was really struggling under the weight of the project, organizationally and just in terms of the sheer size. And as a result, Linus Torvalds and a number of other sort of developers decided to move the development of Linux to Bitkeeper. Now, a number of people expressed some pretty deep concerns about the move, despite the fact that they would all be able to get the community version in order to do their work without having to pay for it. One developer, Alan Cox, who at the time was one of the very most active kernel hackers, and actually maintaining large parts of the kernel, refused to use Bitkeeper at all and had to rely on a series of these gateways that people would set up, which would provide sort of one-way access to the code in Bitkeeper. But Torvalds and other people thought that the benefits brought by Bitkeeper basically were worth it. All right. So this is Andrew Tridgell. Tridge, as he's called, is sort of famous for a number of things, including being the developer of the rsync algorithm and being the person who helped create the Samba project, although those details aren't particularly important here. In 2005, so that is 3 years after Linux moved to Bitkeeper, Tridge began developing an alternate client to Bitkeeper, which he called Source Puller. And it basically was just, it would speak the Bitkeeper protocol and allow you to get metadata on revisions. Now, Tridge had never agreed to the Bitkeeper license. He just reverse engineered it. He actually just telnetted into the port and typed help, and it just explained the, so it's like a pretty funny model of reverse engineering. But Tridge was employed at the time by the open source development labs, OSDL, an organization which is now kind of in some ways morphed into the Linux Foundation, which at the time was also employing Linus Torvalds and a whole bunch of other core contributors. Now, when Tridge did this, when he started this project to essentially build this client, Larry McVoy became incensed. And he announced that he was, he couldn't take away Tridge's license because he didn't have one, but he announced that he was going to take away or withdrawing the licenses from anyone employed by OSDL, which included Linus Torvalds and many of the people that were maintaining core pieces of the kernel. Now, at this point, the community was relying pretty heavily on Bitkeeper, and this was a big problem. Returning to CVS was not an option. So Torvalds and a bunch of the other kernel developers spent a whole bunch of time that they probably would have been spending working on Linux to instead build a new distributed revision control system that would help them do what Bitkeeper did, but to do it using tools that were entirely free software and open source, and that as a result didn't make them subject to the whims of McVoy. And I'm sure you've heard of the system they created, because the system is Git. It's featured in most of the talks we've seen today already, and it's something that I'm sure most of you use every day. It was after a period of pretty rapid deployment and in a pretty chunky state, adopted by the Linux kernel developers, and eventually it was adopted by everyone else. So there's a happy ending to that story, but I think that despite that happy ending, it's important to realize that the events that I've described were deeply disruptive to the Linux kernel and to its development, and they were very costly. So I wish I could tell you that I thought that the free software and open source communities learned their lesson 13 years ago. And I think that the reason I'm standing here, have been invited to stand here now, is because in many ways we haven't. I don't think I need to explain to you what GitHub is, because it is also featured in most of the talks that we've seen so far, at least in one way or another. After the system is heavily integrated into, among many other places, a lot of the CI/CD tools and open development tools that people are talking about and going to be talking about today. And although GitHub began initially as just sort of a website to host Git repositories, and although some people still use it that way, it is now a large proprietary service which is used for tons of bug and issue tracking, branch management, managing pull requests, indirectly for a lot of the CI/CD stuff people are talking about, and much, much more. Today, contributing to a free and open source software project, more often than not, requires using GitHub. I talk to students at my university, technical students, and it's become clear in a couple situations that they thought that Git, the command Git, is just the interface you use to talk to GitHub. And I find this deeply ironic, because Git was created as a way of escaping the reliance of a proprietary software company running a centralized service. And in many ways, GitHub has created many of the problems that Git was created to solve. The parallels, I think, are actually kind of striking. GitHub, like Bitkeeper, relies on a central server that allows a company, GitHub, to monitor users. GitHub, like Bitkeeper, doesn't release its server-side source code or show us what's running on it, at least not most of it. And of course, despite being run by a for-profit company, GitHub, like Bitkeeper, allows us all to use its tools at no cost as long as we're doing it to build free and open source software. And finally, GitHub, like Bitkeeper, can turn any of us off without any warning, without any notice, and for any reason they want. And on this slide is just some text from their terms of service that I pulled this weekend that says exactly that. And I'm not trying to do GitHub scaremongering. I don't think this is because GitHub is horrible. I think this is actually pretty typical stuff. It's typical of the kind of arrangement with a proprietary vendor, which is helping support the development of free and open stuff. And I think that Bitkeeper is a cautionary tale of why we shouldn't do this. So this isn't a talk about why you shouldn't use GitHub, or at least it's not only a talk about that. GitHub is just an example, one example of many proprietary systems and services that I could have talked about. And they're actually a pretty friendly one at that. Compared to many proprietary tools that live sort of within our tool chains, they're in some ways easier to move away from than many of the others. But I think it behooves us to learn from our mistakes in the past. And I can't help but think that our contemporary free and open source software world's continued reliance on proprietary tools and proprietary services suggests that we failed to learn from our experience with Bitkeeper, with Linux and Bitkeeper. So I want to talk about some of those lessons. The first lessons are that proprietary tools can help free and open source software development, and that the people trying to create them are in many cases just trying to help us. There are no villains in this story. There's not McVoy and not GitHub. The people building proprietary development tools and giving them away to all of us that are building the free and open stuff at no cost are trying to help, and they're very often valued members of our community. And what they're offering does, in many cases, help enormously. But despite wonderful intentions all around, the most important lessons is that it was a horrible idea for the Linux developers to rely on Bitkeeper, and it ultimately burned them badly. The fundamental lesson, I think, is clear. When we're building free software or open source tools, we must reject proprietary software development tools. And I want to suggest that there are sort of two main reasons. The first is that not doing so makes us all hypocrites. We should, and I think that's important. It's important not just because we shouldn't be hypocrites, but it's important because not being a hypocrite helps us sell our stuff. We should listen to ourselves when we cite the openness of our software as reasons to choose our stuff over the proprietary alternatives. Openness and freedom means, for our users, that they don't need to worry about predatory vendor lock-in. It means that third parties don't get to snoop on their data. It means that they can join with other users to help find and fix bugs. It means that they can use their software for any reason, and they can never have that permission to do so pulled back if someone, including us, doesn't like what they're doing. Our reliance on non-free tools tells our potential users, software freedom is important for you as users, but not for us as developers. Using proprietary tools to develop free and open source software undermines the basic effectiveness of the strong ethical commitment at the heart of our movements and at the heart of our movement's success. So that's reason number one. The second reason is that the software we produce is only as free as the software it depends on for its continued use, deployment, distribution, and evolution. A free license and full access to source code means very little to a user who's attempting to modify that source code if they don't have access to the software which is required to make and then deploy that modification. It's not only developers' freedoms that's at stake, but eventually it's their users, all future downstream users, and so on. Those choosing to use non-free tools put everyone in the pipeline at the whims of the groups and individuals who produce the tools that lie upstream or downstream, depending on which direction you're looking at it. While proprietary development tools may help us create more free software in the short term, the cost is unacceptable. It's unacceptable from a principled perspective. To compromise our commitment to freedom and openness and attempt to achieve more freedom and openness is self-defeating, it's unstable, and it's ultimately unfair to our users and to the larger community that we're participating in. But it's also unacceptable from a practical perspective. It puts the benefits that our tools might achieve for ourselves and for others at the whim of third parties. It makes everything we might achieve contingent, at least to some degree, on something that we can't control. So what should we do? You won't be surprised to hear that I think that anyone developing free or open source software should ensure that their dependencies, either more dependencies in the technical sense or just the tools that we rely on to get our work done, I think we should use them if and only if they are free. For example, we should use and support free alternatives to proprietary systems. We should use GitLab instead of GitHub. And of course, I understand that these tools are not always as good as proprietary alternatives. I actually have a whole other talk called When Free Software Isn't Better. And I'm not going to give that talk right now, but I can give you a short preview of the very, very end of it, the punchline, where I suggest two things. I suggest three things. Basically, that we should fight for, improve, and create free tools. First, we should convince the people who create proprietary tools to release their stuff freely. It's in their interest to do so. I mean, an addendum to the very first, to the Bitkeeper story is that 2 years ago, 2016, Larry McVoy released Bitkeeper under the Apache license. Right? But by then, it was way too late. Git, the tool which was developed to create an alternative to his proprietary tool, already owned the market. Two, when the free and open tools aren't better, we should take advantage of our freedom to fix it. That means making our stuff easier, not just more featureful. And I understand that it costs time and money, but we need to spend that. We need to make that investment. And third, where the tools don't exist, we need to invest heavily in the development of new tools to help us build free and open source software more effectively and more efficiently. The Linux Foundation does a lot of this. For example, the Ford Foundation is right now actively supporting a bunch of innovative research and experimentation in this area. We need much more of this. The first thing that the sort of early GNU hackers did in the mid-1980s when they set out to build a free operating system, the system that, of course, became GNU Linux and which now runs on all of our servers, many of our laptops, and has parts in many of our phones and embedded systems and cars and televisions. The first thing they did was they focused on creating free tools for creating free software. For example, they created a C library, the project that became Github Is, and they created a C compiler, the project that became GCC. And you know more than I do that the world has changed and that software development looks very different today than it did in the 1980s. But what this means is that, once again, we need to work to ensure that we can produce software freely using unambiguously free tools. Glibc and GCC are not cutting it anymore. Our failure to do so is resulting in software that is indirectly much less free and much less open than its licenses might suggest. The movements for free software and for openness more broadly have not achieved success by compromising our principles. We will not be well served technically, pragmatically, or ethically by compromising the freedom of the tools that we use to build the free and open world. That's what I've prepared. Thanks for having me.